very much to life and for helping us set the scene for a discussion now where I hope there will be some comments and questions and contributions from those who've joined us today, either from your own areas of operations experience or research or interest. And so the floor is open for comments to any one of the panel or just a general question. There's a microphone because we're being streamed live, so that will help others listening online to hear who you are and your particular question or comment. It would be very helpful if you introduced yourself and what organisation or institute you're affiliated to. So any comments or questions from the floor? James, back there.
Thank you, James Darcy from ODI. A comment and a question, if I may. The comment is just in response to what Pete was saying. It strikes me that the humanitarian agencies are going to need to find different roles for themselves in working in urban areas. The things that they have traditionally been good at, they may not be good at anymore. And I'm thinking particularly of kind of construction and public works and so on. There are a few exceptions to this. The ICRC happens to be particularly good at it. But for me, the real area of need here is on the social side of those infrastructural projects and making sure people actually have access to water, sanitation, and so on. And there, I think partnerships, both with government ministries, but also perhaps with the private sector, different kinds of partnerships, are where the humanitarians and indeed the development sector generally could perhaps play a more valuable role. The question I had was really for Cassidy. I wondered if, in putting together the report, you thought about economic shock and the impacts of it. It may not quite fall under our traditional notion of disaster, but as I recall, Dhaka was one of the places where we had food riots a couple of years back. With the shifts you pointed out, the demographic shifts, people are vulnerable in different ways, food insecure in different ways, perhaps no longer net food producers, but net food consumers. What does that shift in vulnerability mean for the Red Cross and for others in the sector?
Thanks, James. Maybe to take that question first of all, and perhaps Peter, reflection to James's comment about the role of aid agencies, humanitarian agencies, perhaps more engaging in physical infrastructure and social infrastructure projects. Cassidy, first, can you respond to that question?
Yes, we did actually look at the economic impacts, and I had one part on that I realized I forgot to say when I was speaking, which was about in 2007 the commodities crisis and how it affected Bangladesh, and just one example. A research that was done looked at day laborers in urban areas and what their wages for one day of labor could buy before the commodities crisis and after the commodities crisis. And they found beforehand people, one day laborer for one day of work was able to buy 5 to 7 kilograms of rice. 1 year later, this was 3.7 kilograms to 5 kilograms of rice. So it was down by 1/3 the amount of food that they could buy based on that. I think that we touched on a lot of sort of different aspects of how disasters affect economies, bothly at the large scale. For example, like the Munich Re data really shows sort of these are macro scale impacts on the economies, whereas the differences between that and how households and how, for example, laborers are affected is very, very different. So we did not focus specifically on that, but there are things on that within the report. Does that answer your question? I think there was a second part.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think you made a really good point. I might take issue about whether humanitarian agencies are traditionally have been very good at construction, but I think the answer, and you said it yourself, is that the social linkages, the community mobilisation. I think that's where humanitarian agencies have a really important role to play, and I think need to explore that more. I agree about exploring partnerships. I think a number of humanitarian agencies, but particularly the Red Cross in Port-au-Prince, doing a lot of work to support DNEPRA, the Water Resource Management Board, the government board in Port-au-Prince, in trying to understand, work out the issues around water and sanitation, and very much trying to bring the community point of view into that. So I concur. I think the points that you make are really valid, and I agree with wholeheartedly.
Thanks. There's a question over here. There's two. Maybe we'll take all of those three in a row. That's very convenient.
Okay, my name's Louisa Medhurst, and I've just finished running NRC's legal assistance program in Juba. So I have a comment to make on what Sara was saying. I think one of the real challenges that we faced was recognising the need, in terms of security of tenure, to look at the role of traditional authorities in that process, because a lot of funding was going to reform of the Land Act and implementation of the Land Act through the formal court system, but not really focusing so much on the traditional authorities who actually have play a key role in Southern Sudan in equitable allocation of land, and their judgment was a lot more recognised by people rather than the sort of formal court system, which was seen as a last resort by a lot of people. So I guess it comes back to partnerships and local partnerships rather than just focusing on the government level, I think is key in terms of security of tenure. And the other comment I think I have, coming back to your research, it will be very interesting to look at post-referendum impact on Juba, because yes, people are okay at the moment, but I don't think that that's going to be the case in 6 months' time. So.
Thank you. Catherine Nightingale, I work in Christian Aid's Building Disaster Resilience community as part of their policy and research lead. And we've been working more recently trying to integrate sort of climate change into our new approach to sort of strengthening climate resilience. And what I thought was quite interesting about this challenge of the new role for humanitarian agencies, or in our case, for a development agency that works with local partnerships for humanitarian response and in disaster risk reduction, is that whether you're a humanitarian agency trying to build partnerships or you're a development agency with those components, they have been quite siloed, and yet increasingly in the last few years there is pressure increasingly, whether it's the increasing sort of climate change agenda or just the need to develop, is to bring those silos together and to work in a much more integrated continuum of resilience, response, recovery and long-term development as part of an overall approach. So my question really is around, or something that we've experienced, and I'm interested to see whether this came out in your research, is around the challenge of donors understanding that continuum. What we've seen in our attempts to be innovative in our sort of processes is that donors are behind this trend, and that it's much harder to fund, across that spectrum. There are humanitarian response funds that, with disaster risk reduction, there is development funding. The inclination to cross that border is a lot further behind in donor agencies. So I'd be interested to hear what your experience has been of that.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Julmy. I've worked with OCHA, including in Haiti after the earthquake, and I'm currently studying at the University of Sussex, doing a master's in climate change and development. And I had a comment and a question. The comment is in terms of Haiti, and I worked in Leogane, and what I saw was a bit different. I saw actually that there was that most of the response was actually focused on the cities, and that rural areas were very much ignored, and that within the cities there was a focus on the camps only, and that other people not living in the camps and not living in settlements were being completely ignored, and that was then causing secondary movement, because people quickly figured out that all the aid was going to the camps, so that was where they should go. So we were actually, instead of encouraging people to stay where they were causing them to go to other areas. actually making the problem worse. And this was something that we're trying to counter, but as you said before, humanitarian agencies in that time were just trying to focus on getting as much aid as they could to as many people as they could, and so this was quite a challenge. So I wonder if you have any comment on that. And my question is more in terms of migration and displacement, both temporary and more permanent as a result of climate change. And this obviously will really affect urban areas, not now, but in the coming future. And I see that there is a chapter on climate change in the report, but I didn't really see much on migration. So I was wondering if you've looked at that issue at all, and if you have comments on that and how it relates to urban contexts.
Okay. And we'll just take one more from over here.
Thanks very much. Alison Evans, Director of ODI. I mean, I think this is a great report and it's really timely, so thank you very much for talking about it today. I just have 2 quick points. They've kind of been picked up by others, perhaps, so apologies if I'm slightly repeating some earlier points. The first is about contexting, and I think there's some really useful information in here. But one of the things I wondered about, I mean, there is another phenomenon that gets touched on here in the chapter on violence, but it seems to me is likely to shape the face of certainly humanitarian action going forward, which is the surge in low-intensity conflict, subnational conflict between non-state actors, particularly around natural resources and various forms of scarcities, which are increasingly concentrated in urban centres. There was a comment made by someone fairly recently in a presentation to the International Development Committee about, see this on a macro scale, that in 10, 15 years' time, we won't be talking about failed states anymore, we'll be talking about feral cities. And I think there is a phenomena there which, when we're thinking about risk and we're thinking about post-conflict, we've got to understand that the nature of conflict is changing and that we won't be talking about interstate, intergovernmental, or even necessarily cross-border conflicts in the way that we have been perhaps in the last decade. So I'll just comment on whether we think this is an important part of the picture. And the other thing is I'm reminded, sitting here and listening to the discussion, that it kind of reinforces this notion that there is no such thing as a pure humanitarian event. And I think everything you've been talking about simply reinforces that. And I suppose the question is, to what extent, following the speaker over there, we need to move to a different model here. I avoid the term continuum. We've had too many continuums in this business. But moving to a different kind of understanding of the model of change, which is built around risk and resilience, which cuts across humanitarian development silos and really begins to think differently about building forward, managing risks, and building resilient futures. And that is a way in to avoid some of this sort of silo-driven thinking, which is somewhat polarized and the debate in recent years. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those range of very interesting comments and challenging questions. I'm going to invite various members of our panel to respond to particular questions that were raised. Maybe starting particularly on this issue that Alison just raised and was raised over here around Doan from our colleague from Christian Aid around the silo approach to dealing with disaster risk and risk reduction and humanitarian response in cities, as opposed to what we've talked around here today, a lot around much broader challenges around resilience and even urban governance. And maybe from a sort of policy perspective, Sara, how you see that and that trend, particularly for often very good reasons, humanitarian policy has tried to keep a distance from that. But are we moving towards a new model that is much more, requires a much more joined up approach?
I think most humanitarian organizations have voted with their feet. I mean, you can hardly, if you take the exception of the IFRC and the Red Cross movement and the MSF, tell me which organization you can classify as pure humanitarian. I mean, operations are more and more integrated. We have more and more humanitarian departments of, say, Oxfam, Christian Aid, or Save the Children that work together with their development colleagues. Where I see the problem, the continued problem, is actually really at the donor level, where funding streams continue to be binary, where no matter how much we continue to emphasize how inappropriate this is, we continue to have separate trust fund for one thing or the other, where inevitably, in situations like Sudan, if you want to use your humanitarian funding, de facto it's really difficult to use it in an urban environment because the criteria won't allow you to use it there. So those who have access to unrestricted funding, and I think actually the fact that MSF and the IFRC are at the forefront of working in urban environment is an indication of that, can prioritize their resources differently, but those who rely more heavily on donor funding are actually constrained. And I think as a community we need to continue to push this back to the donors because we've learned enough. We've learned enough from the importance of joining up our operations, making sure that, we renamed the continuum a long time ago in HPG as Contiguum. You need to be there together at the same time, strengthening the whole spectrum of interventions that, are needed to make communities more resilient. But we're still struggling to make our voice heard. There are donors that are embracing this. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs Denmark has got an integrated humanitarian development department. I think we're seeing some movement in the donor community as well, but it's slow. It's slower than it has been on the operational side. And I think we need to continue to push. And I think working in an urban environment actually highlights even more, more critically how inappropriate this binary funding is, because if there is one situation in which you really have the potential to make your joint action more effective is in urban environment, where you can also enlist the national partners, the government, the local organizations, the private sector. You can actually build a system that as a whole works much more effectively in a more integrated way.
Okay. Thank you. Cassidy, I think this theme of migration is touched upon in the reports from having looked at some of the chapters. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the research you've done and how the current thinking and really challenges around migration in the urban context of the report?
I think we did touch on it in the report on the issues of migration, and I think to give an example, in the research that we did in Dhaka, we looked at how migration is impacting on why people are moving to the city. So we asked people why, how long they've been in Dhaka, where did they come from, why did they move to this particular neighborhood, etc., and what were the sort of driving forces for them coming to the city. And most research in the past has showed that there certainly is displacement from the rural areas in Dhaka, and why we see almost 40% of the growth in urban areas is because of displacement from the rural areas. But a lot of it also is around people are coming there not just because of that, but because of the opportunities. That's what our research showed was really in 2 settlements that we looked at, that most of the people had come there because of economic opportunity rather than being displaced from the areas. But of course, this is one small example, and I think that in general, it has, for cities, has huge implications in the future about how people are why people are coming. And what that will mean, because generally if people are coming because there are more opportunities in the city, that may be true, but if people are being forced to come to the city even without those opportunities for a better life, then this puts even more pressure on the economic systems and the infrastructure systems of the city.
Pete, there was an interesting reflection on the Haiti experience in terms of the perverse incentives that camps can produce in keeping people away from perhaps their traditional affected communities and attracting people to camps, and you reflect on that in your report. Have you got any particular perspectives?
Thanks, Stephanie, for the points that you raised. I think they're really good. The two things to say sort of in response. I think humanitarian agencies need to do more analysis to understand, particularly in that urban city environment, what the dynamics are at play in aid and in seeking to help those who you think need it, and British Red Cross, and I'm sure most other agencies really struggled with this, how to give assistance in a certain place in a way that didn't just act like the candle to the moths, you know, and sort of draw people in. One of the things that we tried to do, and this is my second point, we tried to work with host communities in a region called Lekai, in the sort of south-west part of Haiti, where people had gone to or had sent their families to while they kind of waited to see what was happening in Port-au-Prince. And one of the things we looked to do was a cash-based program that would provide an incentive, frankly, for people to not go back to Haiti. Not go back to Port-au-Prince, which was, you know, seriously overloaded. The brutal reality is we did it too late, and we weren't able to implement the program because people had already gone back. I think the reality of the Haiti context was the entire country economically was so reliant on Port-au-Prince, you know, that one city. I mean, there's a lot of other research about the centralization of the economy in that country, and it is where all the economic opportunity was. So, frankly, we missed the boat, and in fact, it was a very short window of opportunity, and I'm not sure, with the best will in the world, whether it would have worked anyway. But we need to understand what that movement is, what that pattern, what that dynamic. You know, and we think with the right analysis, we can do more there. I'm not saying we'll get it perfectly, but yeah, I think your experiences in Haiti were quite special in many ways. Yeah.
Sara, clearly this challenge around land tenure is very real in Haiti, was in the tsunami, in many of these contexts where agencies like the Red Cross are operating. There was a very interesting comment around the role of traditional authorities in land distribution and the importance of local partnerships in securing land tenure. I just wondered whether some of your research might shed light on that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, these are trends that through our research and the research of others have been captured quite well. I mean, clearly in a lot of these environments, what we see is the existence of what is called legal pluralism. You know, you've got the local customary system, you've got the statutory system, often you have a religious code, you know, in some of the Islamic countries where Sharia applies, they all come to play and they all have a bearing on access to land. And the way people navigate the pluralism, you know, means that they've got many opportunities to try and get a title of a land through what is called forum shopping. You know, they can go to very different places until they actually, you know, get a way of obtaining the title they're looking for. Now, of course, that tends to favor those who've got the money to go through different levels of arbitration, you know, until they actually reach a final and satisfactory result. And this is where organizations can play a role in assisting those that don't have the possibility of sort of spending as much money to make sure that their rights are upheld. Now, the problem is that to make sure that you are provided the appropriate aid, you need to understand the situation well, and you need to understand also what has been happening before the conflict or before the disaster. And I think that's part of the problem, you know, that we often make assumptions or, you know, as the colleague from IFRC was saying, we focus on the wrong things, and like on legal reform when people actually, you know, have got a system that needs to be somehow, you know, put in place and supported to, you know, to be improved rather than a really fabulous law, you know, mutilated from another legal system somewhere else, which is completely alien to the context, which is what's been happening in southern Sudan. I think there is a lot of learning, and more organizations are, and you know, have come to understand the importance of capturing land issues early on in a disaster, in a crisis. We've done a lot of research on this, and we've highlighted a number of options, you know, that are there for humanitarian organizations in terms of providing that contextual analysis, that learning during the crisis that is important in the post-crisis scenario. I mean, the question that was always put to us when we were doing the research on land was always got to do with humanitarian organization. This is something for the development agencies. And instead, you know, really doing that kind of analysis, you know, the monitoring of the secondary occupation of land, the monitoring of, you know, the land grabbing, the advocacy around it, you know, the legal aid that you can provide are all things that we can legitimately do in our mandate. In this continuum we were talking about before, they can help actually, you know, provide better support to communities to make sure that, you know, they can either uphold, you know, their rights to land or get access to them.
an opportunity for final one or two questions, comments. There's
Questions from the computer.
questions from the computer, and then a question here.
Thanks, David. We've got a question from Anna Jeffries of IRIN News. She's based in Senegal. She says, you all mentioned land tenure as being a difficult issue to address in urban disaster response. Can you give any positive examples of where humanitarian agencies have tackled this well through partnering with others or in other ways?
Guess that question is coming back to me.
While you're thinking about response to that, as a
I might be able to answer that question not in a humanitarian, in a non-humanitarian context. Sue Phillips, Social Development Direct, an organisation that has its roots in urban poverty reduction. I wanted to pick up on the Sara raising the issue about donors getting their act together in terms of this sort of dichotomy between sort of development and humanitarian. I'd say equally it's around, for me, the big question, as someone who's been working on the urban agenda for many, many years, is why do donors not prioritise it? I mean, it's still very, very much neglected. And even within our own government, with after the parliamentary committee examining this and heavily criticising DFID, it's still not a priority agenda. And so I sort of would suggest that there's scope for really working together, agencies that have been working from a development perspective in urban areas for many years with humanitarian agencies to really look at how can we more effectively advocate for a focus on urban. And I had a sort of specific question for Cassidy. It was about, you raised, when you talk about governance, you focused on local government. Did you not see a sort of a more important or equally important role for national governments? I'm thinking particularly in the context of Bangladesh and solving problems like Korai, that local government is completely powerless when there is no national legislation on issues such as land. There is no recognition that there is an urban problem. So unless something's done at that level, then there's absolutely no scope for doing anything at the local level. In terms of answer to the question, from our National Slum Dwellers Federation in India, I would sort of highlight as an organisation that has really done an amazing job of getting urban slum dwellers' rights on the agenda, and not just on the agenda, actually dealing with land tenure very successfully.
And I would add that there are some interesting case studies in the report to complement that as well. So, but there's one final question here, and then an opportunity for the panel to respond before we wrap up in 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll keep it short. Saoirse O'Callaghan from the British Red Cross. What I thought was very helpful about the report is the debunking the myths aspect, and about the fact that urbanisation is often incredibly beneficial to populations, but the two different sides to vulnerability, the kind of vulnerability that undocumented and disenfranchised urban populations face in terms of their everyday living, and then when you combine this with disaster, the kind of the double risk that these urban poor and disenfranchised face. And I think in the humanitarian community there's been a real acceptance around disaster risk reduction. But I think, like all the other speakers, I think what the report points to is not that we need to look at disaster risk reduction, but risk reduction much more generally. And I guess it's a question to Cassidy, but maybe to the other speakers, to what degree was the aspect of resilience and supporting resilient communities, either those facing longer term vulnerability in urban settings, or resilience in terms of risk reduction in the face of disasters, an aspect of the report or an aspect of this issue more generally.
Thanks, Saoirse. So final reflections from the panel, starting with Cassidy, particularly that question around resilience and also on the role of national governments.
Thank you for both those questions. I think that in terms of the national level governments and the issues of regulations for land tenure, that there's definitely a role that the national government has to play in developing appropriate regulations for it. But the access to land, as we were mentioning, it depends on, I think, the particular country situation. I mean, whether it's the federal government that owns the land, whether it's agencies of the national government that own the land, or whether it's local government or private owners that are holding the land. I think that it's a very specific situation for each locality. And sort of the negotiations around land have to be very much tailored to what's happening in that particular place. I look, for example, and there was a question about the positive examples of humanitarian agencies. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work in Turkey. In land tenure, yeah. I've been doing a lot of work in Turkey after the earthquakes in 1999, and there, the national government has a very, very strong control over land. But it was, and the humanitarian agencies that worked there, the only times they were able to access land was when they partnered with the local governments, and it was there were successful partnerships with the local governments where they were able to do quite a lot of community rebuilding and community infrastructure, not partnering with the central government, but with the local government. And I think just to make one last comment on that, which is on what Pete had said, which is, I'm just wondering, I mean, the national level Red Cross, for example, in Turkey, they're very much related to the national government and very much tied to the central government. And when they respond to disasters, it's very much in line with central government policies. But I'm wondering what the possibility is of different country programs to develop relationships at the local level before a disaster happens, so that those networks, those contacts, and that understanding of the dynamics in particular cities is there before a disaster strikes. And this may have something to do with this, not the continuum, but the sort of the look across risk reduction and response.
Sara, final comment from you.
Well, two comments. One on land, because the positive examples. I mean, perhaps with the exception of some legal work that's been done in the occupied Palestinian territories by IFRC and other organizations. So she can tell you more about it, because while she was still with us, she did this piece of research, which was very interesting in terms of preventing displacement and land-related displacement. Most of the successful work has been done by local organizations. Again, our research showed examples from the Communauté de Paix in Congo, local organizations in Burundi. Now this study in Khartoum, again, has shown that there are local organizations that provide legal aid about, helping people to secure their titles. And it's been really striking throughout my work on land is that this is an issue that is always so much on the radar screen of local organizations and local actors. They know it, they understand it, they think it's a priority over and above a lot of the things we as external think is a priority. And I think it's really incumbent on us to embrace their agenda, because it is an essential agenda for many vulnerable communities both in urban and rural environment. And the other comment I wanted to make was just a reflection on the language that I think helps perpetuating the divide between the humanitarian and the development community. And that's, thinking of the urban environment, whenever we talk to donors, we had to explain why we were doing the research. We couldn't call people urban poor, we had to call them vulnerable communities. There's almost a kind of specific language, urban poor, is not applicable, to humanitarian action. So we can't talk them, even though it's the other face of vulnerability, the poverty. And I think really there is a lot more work that we need to do as a community, to challenge this really stereotypical definitions that help perpetuate the divide.
Thanks. Pete.
Yeah, I think I'd just respond to the question that came from Senegal, was it? One example I gave in my talk was around the Philippines, and that was an urban context where the local branch of the Philippines Red Cross actually from before the disaster had those links with local authorities and thinking about where was going to be appropriate in terms of possible sites and had the connections whereby they could follow up around land tenure and relocation sites and those sorts of issues. And it was slow process, slow progress, but actually it made a huge difference in the lives of a few thousand families. And the second example that I've got that I didn't include in my speech, but I actually had in front of me, in Malawi there was an earthquake, not many people might have known about it, in December last year, and the British Red Cross provided cash grants for the reconstruction of houses in Karonga town, an urban area. Basically we supported the Malawian Red Cross to do this, and they had to work very closely with local authorities around identifying good locations for resettlement and clarifying land ownership issues, particularly when you were dealing with both house owners and tenants, which is a very common issue in urban environments. That's been a really good example over the last year of addressing positively issues of land tenure in an urban environment. And I think, for me, it illustrates there are these beacons, the good practice that we can identify, we can hold up and say, it's difficult, it's complex, but there's certainly hope, and there's more than hope. There's good practice. We need to do more of that, and hopefully we can, sit here in a few years' time and recognise, the progress that's being made in addressing urban risk. That's what I would just say to finish with.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you very much to the panel for the really good contributions to the discussion, and Cassidy for your overview of the report, and particularly your chapter. I hope from our side that this report will be a valuable and welcome contribution to this critical issue around urban risk, that, as a number of you rightly said, that's not just concerned with humanitarian agencies, but it's something that we really need to join forces on it and work much more effectively across the humanitarian development divide. And thank you very much to ODI for hosting today, and I hope you all enjoyed the last hour and a half. Thanks.